My name is Chris Frew, and I am the CEO of BioBuzz. And welcome to everybody for this exciting program we have. We love doing programs with SOAP because they have such a fascinating content that always generates a lot of interest. So we're excited to have a great panel for everybody today. At BioBuzz, our mission is to create experiences that help you and your companies advance your technologies and connect people to your companies. So this is a great example of that. Really with that, I want to really turn it over to the host of today, Dr. Jeffrey Hausfeld, who's Chairman and Chief Medical Officer of Biofactura and founder of SOAP. So Dr. Hausfeld, it's all you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Adam. And welcome to all those who are participating today. We know there's a lot of content on the internet these days, and we hope to make this webinar both educational, informative, and engaging so that you walk out feeling that you've learned something from the experience. My co-moderator today is Rania Nassis. Rania is another director on the international board of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. She's an independent consultant for many healthcare startups and is the co-leader of the New York City chapter of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. Thank you for helping, Rania. So why did we choose this particular topic today? Because it hits home. At Biofactura, as both the chairman of the board and the chief medical officer, I'm the one who has the responsibility of setting up clinical trials. And I've been doing that for basically the last 2.5 years. And after having met so many potential obstacles and difficulties along the way, I said, there has to be things that other people need to learn from this process. So we gathered the best of the best to help us understand and to promote what is the best practices today and to help you navigate some very choppy waters in making very critical decisions. What kind of decisions are they? Well, it starts with where in the world should I do this? There's lots of places to choose to do your clinical trial. You have to pick a region first. And then you have to pick a CRO, a clinical research organization. Then you have to pick a clinical site. And then you have to pick vendors who will fill and finish your product at, where are you going to do that and how are you going to do that? And you have to pick a regulatory firm. So there's so many wheels and cogs that you have to mesh together to get this to work that we thought that having a really good panel to help us understand the processes would allow us to ask the right questions so you don't make the same mistakes over and over again. Rania, I'm going to pitch it over to you so you can say hello and introduce our first guest.
Thanks, Jeff. Excited to be here. I think this is a very timely topic. And, part of our mission at SOAP is to educate, but also to arm you with the tools that you need to ask the right questions. And so we hope you walk away from this, if you're considering clinical trials, if there's at some point in your future, to be smart about how you have these conversations. With that, I'm going to actually turn it over to our first panelist to introduce himself. Please say hello to Matthew Amston.
Matthew,
oh, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Matthew Amston, CEO of ProofPilot. Thank you very much. I started ProofPilot about 5 years ago, very naively thinking that I was going to completely and totally change the way clinical trials are done. Because in this space, as we are all here today and we understand, is rife with problems. Prior to launching ProofPilot, I was actually a contractor and consultant to the CDC, Johns Hopkins University, and various other academic institutions as they were running HIV prevention trials, mostly in the United States, but some in Latin America as well. I don't think I'm being overdramatic when I say this, but every single one of those trials was a complete unmitigated management disaster. It took a year or more to design the trials. The trials were completely oriented around the researcher, so participants, they felt like cows jabbed with treatments and milked for data. There were all kinds of disconnected systems. It literally made success in these efforts almost impossible. And I was faced with a decision in 2013 whether I was going to continue in this particular space or whether we were going to create something that would allow us to be more effective in designing and managing these trials. And we chose the avenue of creating a platform that would allow us to be more efficient consultants, because you see what was happening is researchers would give us a big 300-page, well, maybe not 300, but maybe 60-page protocol document and say, okay, we're done. This is the final protocol. It will never change. And inevitably, 2 weeks before the study was about ready to launch, it would change, and we would have to change all of our processes and all of our systems to adjust to that particular effort. The first version of ProofPilot was essentially a tool that allowed us internally to create what are today called remote and virtual trials. These were trials that were, again, primarily aimed towards gay and bisexual men in HIV prevention studies, because they were 5 years ago technology early adopters and were really comfortable sharing and collecting data and doing interventions online. Very quickly, we were contacted by various other organizations saying essentially, my population has moved online as well. We'd love to do our trials online. And so we would very quickly adapt and change to different environments, to the point in 2015 or so, we were doing a large number of fully virtual online clinical trials. We then pivoted to actually add in a hybrid trial model. Today, we are launching probably a trial a week. Those trials range in we've done probably one COVID-19 trial every month so far this year, everything from how COVID-19 is affecting mental health and mental health mitigation strategies for anxiety. We've done COVID-19 antibody tests, COVID-19 antigen tests. We have done 3 PMA studies for medical devices over the past several months. All of these trials have been done completely or mostly online. Some of the trials do have in-person engagement components as well. The ProofPilot platform is set up to make it as easy for an individual who has never conducted a trial before to just pick and choose from menus to actually pull that trial together. And at the same time, it is all CFR Part 11 compliant and Annex 11 compliant for EU-oriented efforts, as well as in the United States. And is powerful enough for career researchers. We work across various different fields. So we do pharma studies. Eli Lilly is probably our largest customer at the moment. At the same time, we do studies with United Way for social service program evaluations, health and wellness trials, medical device trials, dietary supplement trials, cosmetic trials. Those trials that are 1,500 to 2,000 people in nature that last several years to try. I think our shortest trial has been several days and the smallest with 9 participants. Our primary goal is really to make it as easy to design and launch one of these trials as it is to manage a blog post, and in doing so create a renaissance in evidence, because that's really where we need to be at the moment. We need to know what works and what doesn't to improve human health, and the way trials are working at the moment, that's very difficult and expensive to do, and we feel that that shouldn't be the case.
Great, thank you, Matthew. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne. And thank you for joining us, to Mike and Yvonne. They're joining us from Australia, where it is very, very early in the morning right now. So we really appreciate it.
It is a pleasure. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Yvonne Lindershausen. I'm the CEO of Advanced Clinical. And Advanced Clinical is a full-service contract research organisation. And we are basically a regional Asia-Pacific CRO. My background is in academic research, and when I was doing my master's, I got involved with doing a trial, and I really liked that regulatory process. And so then I joined a company here in Adelaide, South Australia, where we are headquartered, which was Folding Pharmaceuticals, which had a drug studies unit that became the very first dedicated phase 1 facility in Australia, CMAX. In 1999, it conducted its very first true first-in-human study with a new chemical entity, and that was really, and I was part of that team, and I'd like to think that I've contributed to now what is a really strong early phase destination and space for global companies to come and do their work in Australia. And there's a number of reasons why companies come to Australia, is because there are significant advantages. One of those is the time to which it takes to actually start a trial. So our regulatory process is very streamlined and it allows for a fast startup, which is very attractive. The other thing that's very attractive here is you don't have to have an IND in place or an in-country IND in place to get your clinical data. And so a lot of US companies come to Australia and utilise that advantage to get their clinical data to support their IND or make go, no-go decisions to move forward. So it's a very exciting space. About 60% of our clients come from the United States and are predominantly biotechs, and we like to think of ourselves as the early phase specialists and the CRO of choice for biotech companies. In terms of being able to then pivot from the early phase, phase 1, into latter phase activities, we then work with partner CROs across the globe, one of which is Acronis, who you'll be speaking with as well. And so we have a really neat model for being able to execute not just the phase 1 activities, but right through to phase 2 and beyond. But predominantly, most of our biotech clients come to us because what they want to do is their strategy is to get their phase 1 safety tolerability data, then move into their phase 2 to get their proof of concept efficacy data, and then the general model is that they then on-sell their asset. That's not true for all of them, but it is certainly true for the majority of them. In having said all of that, I think it's really important to note that data generated in our region is readily transferable to EMA and FDA and across the globe. And our organisation has had FDA and EMA inspections. And just in the, I guess the essence of time and to allow everybody else to have a talk, I think I might just stop there, but anyone who's got questions later, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Yvonne. Very good. So let's go to Vlad Bogan, who is the CEO of Chromos Pharma. And Vlad's going to talk to us about doing clinical trials in other areas of the world. You're on mute.
My apologies. Good morning, afternoon, and late night, everybody, and thank you for having me, Jeff. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach here. What we've done at Chromos, and Chromos is an international contract research organization, mostly doing later stage clinical programs, unlike Yvonne. We have modeled a situation in where people who are coming off the COVID hiatus can sort of figure out what would be the best strategy and where to go with their existing programs. This can be easily extrapolated on the new clinical trials that are being launched now. I don't know if we can call this really post-COVID or, the new reality, I guess. So let me quickly run through this. Just by way of introduction, I am the CEO and the founder. I'm a physician. I've trained both here and started my medical school back in Moscow, where I'm originally from. Hence my sort of predilection for that part of the world. When we launched our CRO, I still have a lot of connections, friends, and so forth. But we have grown dramatically in the last few years. We're now in 15 countries across Central Eastern Europe. We're Ireland domiciled and the US domiciled as well. So here's the case study that I wanted to quickly present to all of you. And we took a sort of very benign kind of mid-range clinical trial, a psoriasis study of 600 patients with a newer biologic drug. And we modeled it based on pre-COVID data and post-COVID data. So I'll explain. It's pretty easy to understand. Tell me if you don't see the screen, and I'll adjust it. But so basically, initially the study was supposed to run in the existing countries that you see here on the screen. Western Europe, Australia, And the study was supposed to enroll 600 patients with 503 patients evaluable. This was pre-COVID, and then at the time, the duration of the procedures was about 25 months from startup to last patient in and closeout, which is again quite typical for this type of study. Short duration of treatment in that particular trial. It was a 2B trial. So this graph is to orient you on the timeline as well as the cost. So 100% cost at about 25, 26 months of the trial completion. This is the same graph, and I'm orienting you because it will be important later, as just moving the x-axis to the right. And here is what we have then projected, given the delays and given the honestly, in a lot of places, a complete stop of the trial. We've projected that with everything that's been ongoing with COVID, and this is actually a pretty optimistic scenario, that we would actually be done with this trial with the existing sites in about 32, 33 months, and it will cost about 115% of the original price. Again, quite optimistic, to be honest with you. Now we're seeing, the data that is less optimistic given what's going on. So this is if we do not change the number of sites, the same 58 sites would continue recruiting. We understand that a lot of those sites will not be recruiting as much because patients are not coming in, especially for elective things such as psoriasis. People are coming less, as you well know now, even for things such as acute myocardial infarction. So then we decided to look at what will happen if we do a partial mitigation, meaning that we add within existing territories, we add additional sites. And the cost went up quite dramatically. The duration of the study, based on our modeling, did not change significantly. In this situation, we were looking at 88 sites instead of 58 sites, so quite a significant increase. Unfortunately, the recruitment per site we anticipated was not going to be dramatically better. If anything, it would probably be slower than the pre-COVID. So then we've modeled and looked at a potential addition of additional countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And just to give you a quick overview in just a minute, the reason people go into Central and Eastern Europe is because of the recruitment. We have pretty good quality of data. Cost of research is rather competitive. Highly skilled investigators, highly skilled CRAs, the research staff that we employ, they're mostly MDs and PharmDs. So overall, you get very good value for the amount of money that you spend. So with this in mind, we looked at adding those sites in the countries that I just mentioned, and those are Central Eastern European countries, former Soviet bloc countries, and this is the mitigation major, as we call it, outcome. So the price of the study went up somewhat, although not dramatically, because the cost of the trial in those additional venues is definitely lower, and some of the original burden of the cost from the existing sites was transferred to the newer sites, obviously. So the cost went up just a small amount, and the duration, we were able to project it to be essentially the same. So on this graph, you see that by adding sites in Central and Eastern Europe, going from 58 to 98 sites, and most of the additional would have been in Central and Eastern Europe, we've actually changed the paradigm for this particular trial. And again, right now we're running one of those trials in this particular model. We are yet to report the final results, obviously, they're yet to come, but so far we are on target, both price-wise and in terms of the timeline. So again, just the takeaway points for what's happening in the world right now. I don't think that we will see business as usual for the next year, maybe more. You know, it's unpredictable, but we're definitely penciling in 12 months at least. The site engagement will be slow, even for critical conditions. People are not coming back to the hospitals and clinics with the same vigor as they did before. There's been a surge in activity in post-COVID, you know, after reopening of some of the sites. We've seen some activity, which actually is dangerous for clinicians, for clinical researchers, because it is increasing the competitiveness and the availability of the investigators that are now suddenly flooded with all of those CRAs that are coming to collect their data for the last 5 months, right? So that needs to be also penciled in when you're sort of designing or reinvigorating your trial. We suggest that you are very aggressive with adding sites and countries, obviously within reason, and after doing, you know, significant diligence and feasibility. Again, as previously mentioned, it would be great to minimize, you know, physical interactions and go remote or semi-virtual. Unfortunately, not in every field you're able to do that, and not fully, but we definitely are moving in that direction as well. And we believe that the sooner you start mitigating, the better results you will have. That's it for me. I appreciate your time and would be happy to answer your questions after everybody else is finished with their talks. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Vlad. Okay, so our pinch hitter is Mike Burfield, and Mike is a consultant at Bentley's, and he helps to manage the tax incentive R&D program for companies that do their clinical trials in Australia. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jeff said, my name is Mike Burfield, and I'm the Managing Director of Bentley's R&D Incentives. And Bentley's is an advisory company based in Australia with a team of about 700 professionals. And apart from just broader accounting and advisory and tax-related services, one of our areas of specialisation is helping foreign-owned and controlled companies establish a presence in Australia to manage clinical investments and then claim what's called the R&D tax incentive, or in more simply, the R&D rebate. And this is a program that can, under its present legislative framework, enable companies to get a rebate of up to 43.5 cents in the dollar of every dollar that they spend on clinical work in Australia. And that's a pretty hefty incentive and makes a really big difference when you consider all of the other benefits that Australia provides foreign and controlled companies that are doing clinical work in Australia. I've been involved in this program for nearly 30 years, and you haven't got a close up, but I'm pretty old, right? But and getting older every day. And it's, what is it now? It's 2 o'clock in the morning here, and somehow it's still going, but that's good. That's good. So my background, though, despite being involved in R&D tax for that long a time, my background is actually in venture capital, and I was really probably one of the worst venture capitalists I've ever lived, and it was predominantly because I loved the tech. Whereas most VCs are focused purely on the money, you know, what are we getting at the end? Whereas I really like the technology, and it drew me into the incentive and other sort of government incentive type programs because it enabled me to focus on, I suppose, talking up the technology as opposed to looking at the weaknesses. And then that naturally drew into the R&D tax incentive. And they changed the legislation in this program in around about 2012. Where it wasn't necessary any longer for the intellectual property of a particular undertaking to reside in Australia, which meant that foreign and controlled companies could come to Australia and undertake research and development where the intellectual property could reside offshore. And that opened up a huge opportunity for Australia to do this sort of work. Back in the time in 2012, there was really very little known about the ins and outs of how could a foreign and controlled entity manage this program. So we kind of self-taught and we were groundbreaking in a number of aspects of the legislation today, and a number of the, I suppose, some of the more niche elements around what is eligible and how to optimize both compliance and optimize the returns that a company could get. At the end of the day, we talk about it being the R&D rebate, or it is effectively the R&D tax incentive. It is a tax-based program which deals with the concept of eligible expenditure that's incurred on eligible activities within projects of eligible companies. Now, the takeaway from that, there's no such thing as an eligible project. It's all about eligible activities. And activities in this program are generally considered either what they call core activities or experimental activities, or the activities that have a direct scientific link that support those experiments. Now, the beauty of this sector, the biosector, or the biotech sector, medtech, whatever we want to call it, is that it will always satisfy the eligibility requirements, or a clinical trial will always satisfy the eligibility requirements of an experimental activity, because it's generating new knowledge where the outcome was not determinable in advance. Now, I don't want to bore you with legislation, but what I will say is that it's probably best that, I mean, just one other thing for us is that where we're differentiated is that we provide a one-stop shop, right, with a single point of contact, where we provide all of the services under a single roof that enable you to establish a presence in Australia and manage that presence in Australia, right through to claiming the incentive and then ultimately exiting Australia. It's quite complicated in some aspects. It's simple but complicated, and the key is in the setup. So I won't talk much more, but I will say this: the questions that I am always asked and around this, around the R&D tax incentive are, what is eligible R&D? It all sounds too good to be true, so why is the Australian government doing this? Doesn't make sense. And the Americans in particular say, I don't get it, it sounds too good to be true. The other is, what are the traps, right? What doesn't work? What are the things I need to consider? And the final one is really, can I claim expenditure outside Australia that supports Australian R&D activities? So I've got answers for those. If there are any questions that come up, I'll be delighted to answer those. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Brian, I'll send it to you so you can start off the Q&A session.
Sure. Since we're doing this in a very different time, a time of COVID, there are some changes that are going to stick, some changes that are, there's going to be a new normal. Some things will stick, some things won't. Let's talk a little bit about what has COVID accelerated. For instance, moving towards remote and hybrid trials, how much of that is going to stick? And how much of this is actually accelerating some things that maybe we wanted to happen for a long time? Similar to what we see in telemedicine, for instance, telemedicine adoption was relatively low in the US, and through COVID, we're seeing several thousand % increases in utilization. Do you see this as pushing a lot more clinical trials to going to hybrid or as remote as possible? And I will throw that question over to you, Matt, to start, and then anybody else can jump in after.
Yeah, sure. So let me give you some stats from what Proof Pilot is seeing at the moment. We're a relatively young company. We've really only been operating for about 3 years now. In 2019, we did 4 trials. In January of this year, it looked like we would probably do 4 to 8 major trials over the course of the year. Then March happened. We are now launching an FDA-regulated trial once a week on our platform. So that gives you a sense of how quickly things are accelerating. The trials that we had launched in January, a couple of them were for large pharmaceutical companies, and we heard through the grapevine that the trials that were on the Proof Pilot platform at that pharmaceutical company were the only trials that were continuing over the course of the lockdown period in March and April particularly, except those that were cancer trials that were showing significant opportunity to save people's lives. As far as kind of where I see this going at the moment and whether this will stick, I remember the first pitch event that I did, which would have been in mid-2014, folks saying, oh, pharma will never, ever do remote trials. It's just too scary, it's too experimental. We're seeing pharma do remote experimental trials, and we're seeing pharma organizations that used to just have innovation groups actually shift those groups to actually be groups that are doing their own trials now. So they're not necessarily contracting out to do the trials, they're bringing the trials in. in a space that some of our customers are calling remote staffless trials, where essentially there's a group of folks at the pharmaceutical organization that are saying, hey, we're going to do our own trials, we're going to launch them quickly in a couple of months, and we're only going to intervene with staff in the case that something really wrong happens. And we've now done several of those over the course of the past couple of months. They've all been fairly successful. Some of them are still running just because that's their time frame. I think that it is inevitable that we're going to be moving towards this remote or hybrid oriented approach. Participants like it, CROs like it because it maintains a level of control that they didn't necessarily have over sites before. Pharmaceutical companies like it because it's less expensive. Investors like it because there's a stronger ROI. I don't see it necessarily changing. It's just accelerating something that folks thought was a kind of scary experiment prior to all this. Then it became the only way to conduct trials. And now folks are kind of like, well, you know, it's really not that scary. So let's continue.
Okay, and Matthew, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, just as I do with my folks who do telemedicine, in that there's a certain portion of the physician-patient interaction that is missing from telemedicine visits. And there are certain things that I speak to my colleagues and they say, listen, it's good to say hello. It's good to, you know, for the worried well, it's good for a triage. But if I'm a cardiologist, I can't listen to their heart. I can't listen to their lungs. I can't do the kind of exam that I would do in person. If I'm an orthopedist, I really can't tell if, you know, if they have full range of motion or not. So there are limitations. It's really good for dermatology. It's really good for psychiatry and psychology. But what are the limitations that you would see in a clinical trial, especially if you have to get blood draws on these patients for either PK, PD, or immunogenicity, or all those things that, all the biomarkers that we're looking for as we move them along the trial?
So let's take, so there are a couple portions of their question there, and let's take it in parts. First off, Proof Pilot considers itself a hybrid study platform. So about 70% of the trials that are run on Proof Pilot at the moment are remote only, meaning that participants engage by themselves at home. Now, that does not mean that those individuals are not collecting specimens. I don't know how many devices and how many blood specimen collection kits we're delivering to people's homes now. It's kind of crazy, actually. So we are able to do some of those things. And the other thing to think about here is that some of the opportunities that we don't necessarily have in a remote-only trial opens up new ones. So for example, we have an AFib trial now where individuals who already have a heart implant are the only ones eligible for the trial. And so in that particular case, we are using that implant to actually collect data that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, because we would have had to get too many sites to engage to get the number of individuals that we were looking for. So it did require rethinking a protocol to do it in a remote-only manner. Now, having said all that, by hybrid, I mean that there are some trials that people do have to go into a clinic or do have to have some kind of in-person interaction. I remember one of the very first conversations I had with an advisor when we were starting the company, and he was talking about his protocol, and we were looking through kind of what we were asking folks to do. And this was a phase 2 cancer trial for an orphan disease. And there were people that were literally flying into New York from all over the world to participate in this trial. And some of the study visits were literally only things like, my pain is X, my digestion is Y, my sleep is Z. And I don't know about you all, I haven't been on a plane since March, but traveling, I have no illness at the moment. I'm very healthy, thankfully, but I have pain when I travel. It's very unpleasant. And so that individual who's already sick, who actually comes into the clinic, literally just to fill out a form that says that they don't feel that their pain is at a certain level, it's completely wrong. It's not valid in many ways. So it does require rethinking a protocol a little bit. It does require kind of thinking, okay, maybe there are some things that we do have to do in person. We're doing a lot of COVID-19 antibody tests at the moment where we're validating whether an individual who is not a high complexity lab can conduct the test. That's got to be done in person because it's meant for an in-person interaction. but some things just don't, and they probably shouldn't have been in the first place. And so it's giving a lot of us an opportunity to rethink those things.
Right, just as we thought about adaptive clinical trials, now we're thinking of adding this virtual and data-driven component to it. Now, I'll follow up with one last question before we move on.
Yeah.
So you're going to collect all this real-world data and real-world experience, and that tsunami of data becomes difficult to manage. Can you utilize artificial intelligence, machine learning to convert that data into something that is more actionable and something that can be interoperable with your mastered file?
Yeah. So the way ProofPilot deals with data is we are a single source of data. So data comes in and we store it in a very specific format. And that is done very specifically so we can run automated t-tests and trigger p-values and things like that, and actually use that data. We update our reports every 24 hours. So if you're doing a remote-only trial, for example, and you've got participants all over the world, you're literally looking at real-time data every 24 hours. And we don't necessarily do the t-tests and statistical analysis on a daily basis, but we do it on a weekly basis. I mean, that all comes down to our insistence to actually have all of the data in one place and all in the specific format. So when we're ingesting data from a connected health device, like we have a partnership with Withings and a similar arrangement with Oura Ring and another with a continuous blood glucose monitor. When the data comes in, it comes in a specific format, or we repurpose it so it matches the ProofPilot approach. So it gives us the advantage of being able to look at the data in almost real time. When I say almost, like I said, it's delaying by about 24 hours. Okay, thank you. Rania.
Great, and I'm monitoring the Q&A, and we've had quite a few questions come in about recruitment. Recruitment, always a challenge with clinical trials. Seems it would be more so in some cases with COVID. So Yvonne, I'm gonna throw it over to you to take the first stab at this. You know, what are you doing differently for recruitment? What has worked before? What do you see continuing to work? And what's your approach been?
So look, Australia is in a unique position because we haven't had the same impact as, you know, many other parts of the world in terms of COVID. And, you know, you can see that Mike and I are sitting here in a boardroom together, and in fact, you know, the office is full, not at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's just the two of us here and an IT guy. But so we've been very fortunate. So initially when COVID hit in March, you know, people were sent home. We were, you know, asked to isolate, and a lot of our trials, because there was a lot of nervousness, had to pivot, and we had to, as a CRO, pivot very quickly to a digital platform and, you know, e-technologies, e-consent, e-source, you know, and e-monitoring. But we very quickly moved back again to being able to physically go to a site and, you know, do source data verification and monitoring as you would, you know, in the standard process. And it's very interesting because some of our sponsors were very comfortable to have that fast data coming in, and others wanted to move back. So look, you know, to answer a question that was asked earlier, do we see this staying, or do we see this as being a bit of a hybrid? And I personally think that, you know, digitalisation and e-technologies are here to stay, and I think it's going to revolutionise the way that we do clinical trials. But I think that there's going to be a balance of that, and also having a touch point with the sites, because I think if everything is too remote, I think there's real concerns about, you know, some of the quality aspects and that actual monitoring ability. And I think the regulators, because of COVID, have had to pivot also very quickly to allow trials to continue, but I think they'll pull back. That's my personal view. But your question was about recruitment, and I think what COVID has done has made us think a lot more broadly about the opportunity to do things remotely and to use electronic technology to access patients who otherwise might not have come into a trial because they were too remote. And so you now have an opportunity to draw patients from areas where they wouldn't have come from before, and they can actually join the trial because they can be e-consented. But I do think it's horses for courses. I think it really depends on the type of patient and the schedule of assessments. And so it doesn't, it's not a fit for all, it's a fit for purpose type scenario.
Lad, what's your experience in recruitment in a COVID world in Eastern Europe?
Well, we got, obviously we got stopped in March. We were idling for a couple of months in terms of site visits. That really forced us to go to remote monitoring, and that was quite an adjustment, obviously. We were lucky enough to get several COVID trials on board, which were completely remote trials, all of them. Again, the amount of man hours that we've spent on going through data verification and data analysis, data input were tremendous. Again, I want to come back to the question that you initially posed to Matthew. I think the whole concept, the paradigm shift is happening. There's no doubt about this. There'll be more remote activities, more device-driven activities, and so forth and so on. I think it will come to a hybrid model. I agree with Yvonne completely. It's not, unfortunately, we run a lot of oncology trials. You cannot do a remote cancer treatment, and you cannot do a remote PET scan, CT scan, MRI, and so forth. So there will be a lot of this kind of interface between technology and human visits. I think one issue that we're still tackling with and still trying to address fully is source data verification. That's a major problem for us because with all the HIPAA regulations in the US and local regulations in other countries, unblinded data cannot be fully transported. So, we're looking at solving this issue. There are solutions now that are becoming more and more available in different parts of the world, but it is an issue, and the quality of data is something that is of concern right now. I know we will address it one way or another, but right now we are going back to the sites and we are doing SDVs, either 100% SDV or an elective SDV, and that's very, very important for your subsequent FDA or EMA scrutiny and so forth. So that's something that we've been dealing with. But overall, definitely a paradigm shift in how we run the trials.
And before I give it back to Rania, Mike, is it too good to be true, this tax incentive?
Look, it certainly isn't. I think the hardest part of it for a lot of people to comprehend is generally why does the government do this? What's in it for Australia? And I think we've certainly seen the case because we also provide R&D services for a number of suppliers to the clinical trial sector, not just the participants themselves. And it certainly enabled Australia to build a capability and some skills and knowledge, which has enabled it to differentiate itself from other parts of the world in itself. It's also employed a tremendous amount of people. So that part of it, there is absolutely a benefit to the Australian taxpayer through this program in terms of skills and knowledge. But I think the hardest part for people to understand is the Australian government's not stupid in the sense that we don't just enable companies to set up in Australia, claim this wonderful benefit, take away all the money, and that's it. I mean, there are things that they need to consider. And this is a discussion I can have for hours, so I'll just be really short, is that in the setup of an Australian company, there are things that companies need to consider in terms of how does the Australian economy, or how does that Australian subsidiary benefit from the tax incentive that it gets. So just a very quick thing I'll say about this, in order for any expenditure to be deductible at all and then hence eligible for the R&D incentive, it has to be incurred in pursuit of prospective income, the pursuit of prospective income. Doesn't mean you have to generate income in Australia, but it has to be done so with the prospect of generating revenue, which means the Australian company needs to be given some rights or some form that it can generate revenue from the contribution that's made to the intellectual property associated with the clinical trial. It's a big discussion and it's not well understood. But as a large organisation where we have tax professionals, R&D professionals and the like, we have the skills internally to be able to do that sort of work. It is a cookie cutter approach, one size fits all. Once you know, you know. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
That's good, Mike. And I'll just tell the audience that this is an extremely complex R&D tax credit program that you probably would not be able to navigate yourselves. So you need to get some professional help. And there are lots of people out there that do this. Mike is one that I have vetted for the last 2 years and found to be an excellent and reliable source of truthful and transparent information. So that's a quick plug for you, Mike. But this is a difficult subject. Find someone you trust to help you through and get it right. Rania, questions?
Yeah, I'm going back to sort of this paradigm shift that we're seeing, and obviously everything's not going to go completely remote. We do need hybrids, but we're going to start to rethink what actually has to be done in person. That creates a paradigm shift also in a procedural perspective, right? People are trained that are running clinical trials to do things a certain way, and now they need to be trained to do it a different way. How would a startup or an entrepreneur vet their vendor to make sure that they're actually set up to do this properly, especially since many CROs are actually figuring this out as they go? Yvonne, it sounds like.
Look, yeah, I'll take it, and I'm happy for anybody to chime in, Vlad or Matthew. So, look, in the COVID world, and, you know, I have to speak from, you know, the perspective of the Australian perspective. Look, we've been very lucky here, as I've said. And, you know, if you wanted to do a COVID trial, we did have, look, Australia is basically an island nation. And South Australia has made itself an island within an island. So you would have seen, you know, in the news reports that Melbourne, Victoria did have a second wave, and we basically closed the borders. We're handling things differently to other parts of the world and sort of isolated them. And so if you wanted to do a COVID trial, you could certainly do that in Melbourne, Victoria at the moment. But, you know, we've had a number of requests for companies to do COVID studies, and you know, I'm sure it's happening in the US and other parts of the world as well, that when you talk to the investigators, they're swamped because everyone's wanting to do a COVID trial. But I think what we're seeing is that in terms of being able to, you know, execute trials in this space, one thing that Australia has done, we have a central IRB or ethics committee here, and what they've done is they've fast-tracked those trials. So in terms of that COVID space, there are also treatments for trials, which are new chemical entities, or, you know, not just repurposed drugs, and they need to go through that safety testing that you would normally do in a healthy volunteer. And we've actually conducted a couple of those, or they're ongoing and running. And from the time of submission to approval is 2 weeks. I mean, that's just incredibly quick. And I know that that's happening across, you know, many parts of the world where ethics committees are fast tracking those review processes, but that's certainly happening here in Australia. And I would say to anybody looking to do trials, that you look at the region to see, you know, you've obviously got demands in terms of timelines and cost implications in terms of doing a trial. And so you need to do your homework to see what region of the world is going to be able to accommodate what I need to do. And it's more complex now with COVID, because obviously in some parts of the world sites aren't open and can't do that work. I mean, Australia is being inundated with clients coming here for early phase work that's been stopped, you know, in other parts of the world where we're able to actually just get up and go and navigate through all of this. So it's you know, I think it's very important to assess a region. And, you know, it's very difficult to predict what that will look like in a couple of months' time. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, for a lot of people at the moment. And it's really about pivoting, adapting, changing, trying to be nimble. And as a service provider, it's really important to be able to give some confidence to your sponsors that you're able to do that. Matthew and Vlad, do you want to add anything there?
So before we move on, in Australia specifically, Yvonne, have you seen any difference between phase 1 healthy subjects as volunteers versus a phase 2 or phase 3 where you're looking for disease-specific targets?
It was definitely a concern for us initially, you know, in terms of nervousness of patients or healthy volunteers to go to a clinic. But because we've managed it so well, with the exception of one state, and you know, we've been able to pivot out of that state really very quickly, or employ digital technologies, e-technologies, like I said. No, we have had no issues. Basically, social distancing requirements have come into force in Australia, and so the capacity of a lot of the units and the clinics has been reduced. That's actually been the requirements for that have been reduced now as well, because of the good management in Australia. But we have actually not seen an issue with being able to recruit either healthy volunteers or patient populations, and even those that are, you know, might be considered to be highly susceptible in a COVID type environment. So for example, we're running a cystic fibrosis study very successfully in Australia at the moment, whereas in other parts of the world, those patients wouldn't be seen near a hospital because of the potential threat of, you know, maybe not coming out of there.
Right. Vlad, anything to add?
Again, if we are giving advice to our biotech entrepreneurs, people that are going into clinical trials, I think given the uncertainty that Yvonne has mentioned, go wide, at least assess widely. You don't have to eventually go into every site, every country, every, you know, go to every investigator, but at least have this as an opportunity, because what we've seen, especially in North America, is that there is a significant slowdown in the number of the sort of conventional patients that come into clinical trials. You know, Matthew may be lucky with his, you know, remote stuff, but unfortunately for, you know, your typical trials, there's a trickle. And so go, I'm obviously biased, go to Europe, go to Eastern Europe, go to Australia, go to, you know, places that are suitable for your particular indication, for your particular budget, for, you know, for the type of therapy that you're providing, but definitely assess widely, because things will be slower. Again, I don't want to be a glass half empty guy, but, you know, we just have to face the reality. So.
Well, Vlad, when you're going to these different countries, unfortunately, there's no universal protocol that can be followed because of the different regulatory environments in each of those different, especially Eastern European countries. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's why you need somebody like us. I mean, again, sorry for the plug, but you do need local, you know, local experts, because you're absolutely correct. You know, you go even within EU, for instance, you know, regulatory is different. You know, you go to Poland, you have one set of, you know, requirements. You go to Hungary, it's a different set of requirements. You go to, you know, Ukraine, Georgia, Russia, whatever, you know, it's a very different set of rules. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all very manageable, and we're, you know, our startup times are very, very lucrative for you know, for the biotechs, but you need to know the specifics. So absolutely you have to, like you were utilizing Yvonne and Mike, and in Australia, you know, you need to utilize somebody who has very good local expertise in those countries. Again, obviously, I'm plugging myself here because this is where we operate. This is our kind of, you know, bread and butter. But what is also important, and I think one thing that biotech entrepreneurs should take advantage of, is that most of, you know, reasonable companies that have been around would be willing to do a free feasibility work for you, and that's very important, and you get a lot out of this. So for instance, somebody comes, and, you know, Jeff comes to me with his, you know, biosimilar project, and we will run our countries, and we'll tell you, you know what, do not go to Poland because they're flooded with studies. You know, there's a lot of competition. You're not going to be able to beat it, or, you know, there's some certain specific rule that will prevent you from going into this indication, or, you know, we'll definitely sort of dissect it, and we'll give you our advice as to where to go, how many patients we potentially can recruit in each venue, and I think that gives you sort of general idea. Usually when we get those feasibility analyses from the sites, we divide it by 2 when we give it to you, because everybody is slightly too optimistic usually. But at the end of the day, you do get a realistic picture, and that kind of helps you make your decision at the end of the day.
Thank you, Vlad. Vanya, maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll start to wrap up.
Sure. We're getting a few questions around sort of recruitment of particularly underserved populations or populations that are more difficult to recruit. So for instance, children, having a more diverse population is clinical trials historically have skewed Caucasian, predominantly male. What opportunities do you see or challenges do you see going forward with recruitment of those types of individuals? And are there any recruitment strategies that you've seen be very effective?
I'll speak up.
I can quickly, sorry, Matthew, just a couple of words. So one thing that is useful here, as well as with, just general post-COVID situation, is outreach. So this is what, Yvonne has mentioned. We're doing a lot. We've been talking about this a lot previously, but we're really doing this right now, is we're having a network of referral sites throughout, and we can reach out to different types of facilities, the ones that cater to lower income populations, specific demographics, and get those patients brought into the centers that are qualified to do clinical research. And it does come with a certain fee that we pay those external physicians to help us screen those patients, but at the end of the day, it's well worth it. So this is one thing that we've been utilizing very successfully. And I'm sorry, Matthew, I interrupted you, so I'm done.
No, so I was going to say that referral orientation is really, really important. We took it upon ourselves very early on because a lot of the organizations that Proof Pilot works with are very small and the budgets are extremely limited. And we needed to find new ways to recruit individuals that in some cases had cost nothing. And in doing so, we determined very early on that those recruitment modalities needed to look like the type of person that you were recruiting. So if we are trying to recruit an individual in the Republic of Georgia, that was literally one of the first countries in which I had any kind of clinical trial experience, you didn't want to have an African-American in your recruitment ad. And literally we saw African-American individuals in recruitment ads in Republic of Georgia. I never saw an African person in that country. And it sounds really straightforward and kind of obvious, but I continue to be surprised how often someone says, well, I really want to recruit African-American individuals into the study. And they think that slapping a Harvard logo up on the ad and putting a Caucasian woman in the ad is going to do the trick. It doesn't. You've got to really think about, who are the organizations that are actually serving these individuals? Who do they trust? And use them as your front guide. At Proof Pilot, we consider some of the first steps of a research study to be a form of online media. And so you've got to think like a media entity, just like the competition for attention for that time that someone's going to spend going into a clinic or doing whatever the referral happened, the inclusion-exclusion survey happens to be. That's time that they could be watching Netflix or going through Twitter or looking at Facebook or Instagram. And so you've got to think like those kinds of organizations. You've got to think like a social media influencer. What's my audience going to be interested in?
I'd just like to add too, I think recruitment is such a critical piece of doing any sort of clinical trial. And I think, it's already been said, Vlad mentioned it, I think it's about doing that feasibility and doing a strong feasibility and, reach out to your networks. But it's really important, depending on the therapeutic indication, to actually have a good network of clinicians and key opinion leaders and really drive those relationships. And that's why you need to pick a CRO that's had good experience and can do that. And obviously, recruitment for a healthy volunteer population is very different to, looking at a patient population. And then I think, Aranya, you mentioned pediatrics, and there's a lot of groups that won't even look at pediatrics, and that's got a whole lot of its other, its own nuances in terms of consent and, the age of, if you're looking at neonates versus adolescents. And so I think it's really important to be able to, when you're selecting a CRO to work with, have a look at their previous experience and, make an assessment on whether or not they've done those studies before and who are their networks. I think that's really, and that's just probably my take-home message for everybody listening.
Okay,
good. So I'm going to ask you all to kind of give us a wrap-up statement, but in that wrap-up statement, include this. what's the one important thing that I, as a sponsor, didn't think of and will be likely surprised by? Matthew, let's start with you.
Okay, we've talked a lot about participants and technology and remote engagement and recruitment. And the thing that I have been most surprised by in this effort is when we are reaching out to doctors and physicians and clinicians, that we don't necessarily screen those individuals in the same way that we do for patients, and train them and we make assumptions that they are going to be as comfortable with technology as an average participant is, and they're not. So the things that we have learned in hybrid studies is that we need to spend much more time vetting particular participants, vetting particular physicians and clinicians in their capacity to both understand what the trial is, that's obvious, but also in their comfort level with technology, because if we're doing a hybrid study, they're going to get questions. And if they have trouble figuring out how to open up a calendar or what Gmail is or what social media is, they're not going to be able to, one, use some of this remote technology, and certainly not going to be able to help the participant. So kind of wrapping it all up, from that perspective, again, hybrid is definitely the way things are going to go. We are encourage folks to kind of rethink their protocols, because just there are opportunities that hybrid opens up and remote data collection opens up that isn't necessarily feasible in a traditional in-clinic trial. And that is obviously, from Proof Pilot's perspective, the future.
Vlad?
Come to whoever you choose, come to them early. Come early with your protocol. Do not come with something that you think is going to be your final perfect version, because we can add a lot of value to your inclusion-exclusion criteria, looking at specific patient population, because when you come with a certain preconceived design that you think is going to be perfect, it may not translate into real life fully. So especially now, and I agree with Matt, that going with a hybrid version definitely changes the way you address this in the protocol. So very important. We're actually working now with one of the sponsors where we're actually rewriting their protocol for them because of that specific issue, because of the remote data collection, and that changes the way you do your informed consent form, the way you sign up legally with the sites, because of the data transfer and data sharing. So all of this, again, the earlier you come, and the market is such as that, believe me, we'll take your call. We'll be talking to you, so you don't have to pay us to do that. So come early.
Can I second that? Come early, because as we are moving towards remote approaches, there are so many different things that if you haven't done a trial in the past 6 months, there's a lot that's changed in that time period. So come early, because many of us have been doing trials during this time period, and we have some experience with some of those new techniques.
Mike?
So thanks for the opportunity, guys. Look, the key message is that the R&D incentive is very real, right? There are hundreds of companies that have set up in Australia and successfully claimed this. The key is in the setup and working with a trusted partner that knows what they're doing. The only other key message from this, which is just a quick takeaway, is that when recruitment is difficult in Australia, you can still do clinical work in Australia and outside Australia and still claim it under the R&D incentive through what's called the overseas finding. There's specific provisions in that enable you to undertake clinical trials all over the world, or R&D work all over the world, and still claim it under the R&D incentive in Australia. Last bit, no such thing as a stupid question. Please ask, and we are extremely generous with our time to help you get to an informed go, no-go decision. So ask. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, guys.
Welcome. Yvonne?
Yeah, look, I think both Matthew and Vlad stole my thunder, because I was going to say come early for a lot of reasons. But one is that I think you can sometimes be surprised. You have a preconceived idea about what the pathway is and what the trial design needs to look like. And coming to an experienced group like any of us, we're all in the world of adaptive design. Sometimes we can get your clinical data faster than what you might expect that you might need to get it. You know, we can do SAD, MADs, we can see some crossovers at and a patient cohort in the same protocol. And my message would be in these, I mean, you know, 2020 has been a year that's shown us that we should expect the unexpected. And so be prepared to find yourself a trusted partner and somebody who's got your back and who will change and be able to be nimble and adaptive with you as you might have to change what your plan was because of the way the environment is. So you want somebody who is prepared to say, okay, this was our plan, but we're going to now go fully digital or electronic because the site now can't see us. Yeah, so expect the unexpected and find a group that will be prepared to work with you to do that.
Thank you, Yvonne. Rania, I'm going to send it back to you for any last comments and a plug for the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs.
Sure. We hope that you enjoyed this content. We try our best to bring informative discussions to the group. And obviously, in light of COVID, we're trying to do more and more online. Always open to suggestions on things that everybody wants to hear about. We think this is particularly a hot topic right now. A lot of people are looking to do clinical trials and need to consider what impacts there's going to be long-term following COVID. And I think beyond that, just in general about clinical trials, it's always great to be educated about the right questions to ask. We encourage all of you to become members. It is only $80 a year at soapnet.org, and you get access to content. And when the world opens up again, you'll get to meet some of us in person as well too. And so in the meantime, more webinars to come. I want to thank all of our speakers. You were all fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time. And extra special thanks to Yvonne and Mike for staying up so late to join us. It's been wonderful. And we didn't get to all the questions. I know there are some very specific questions, so I would encourage some of you, if there's a specific question for a panelist, I think I speak for all of them and say it would probably be okay for you to reach out to them directly to get those answers to your questions. And we will be sending out some recap articles as well as a video of the event over the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned and watch your inbox. And a special thank you to BioBuzz, who's been our partner in several of these, and it's been fantastic working with them, and we feel that this is a really great synergy. With that, I want to thank all the attendees and the panelists and Jeff, my co-moderator, and I will throw it back to you for the final goodbye.
So again, thank you, Rania. Thanks all the panelists for participating today. Thanks to all those who attended. Thanks, BioBuzz. This is not a sprint. Trying to do a clinical trial is a long haul marathon. You can't have the mentality of running down a track and trying to finish it in 4 months. That's just not going to happen. Hopefully, we've given you that perspective today so you can plan accordingly and be successful. Thank you all for watching. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye, Vlad.